Picture the Sahara Desert. Now picture it green. Not a metaphor, not a thought experiment, an actual documented period in human history when one of the driest, most hostile places on the planet was instead a sprawling savanna dotted with lakes, rivers, hippos, giraffes, and crocodiles, soaked by monsoon rains that fell so consistently for so many thousands of years that early humans built entire settlements directly into rock shelters carved by water that no longer exists there today. That period is called the African Humid Period, and it ran for roughly 10,000 years. Rain that, in some regions, simply never seemed to stop, and the humans living through it didn't just survive. They thrived, painted thousands of images of swimming figures and water buffalo onto cave walls, and left behind a genetic and archaeological record so detailed that scientists are still extracting ancient DNA from their bones today, piecing together exactly who these people were and how they managed to build entire lives around a climate that has since completely vanished from the region without a trace of its former lushness remaining. So here's the actual question worth asking. How do you survive endless rain when you have no concrete, no waterproof tarps, no rubber boots, and no umbrellas? When the sky simply doesn't stop, season after season, sometimes for years at a stretch, with no forecast and no warning of when it might finally let up? The answer involves geological water reservoirs hidden underground, animal hides engineered with more precision than people realize, entire civilizations whose survival depended on a single river's flood cycle, and the genuinely fascinating reality that for our ancestors, rain wasn't always the enemy. Sometimes it was the entire reason civilization became possible at all, rather than the catastrophe most modern people instinctively assume it must have been. Let's start with the most basic problem rain creates, because it's not actually the wet part, it's the cold. Hypothermia, not drowning, is the primary threat posed by sustained rainfall in most environments, especially in temperate or cooler climates where ancient humans spent enormous stretches of their evolutionary history before ever migrating into warmer regions. Wet skin and wet clothing lose heat dramatically faster than dry skin and dry clothing, because water conducts heat away from the body far more efficiently than air does, pulling warmth directly off the skin's surface. A human can survive surprisingly cold air temperatures as long as they stay dry. The same human, soaked through in identical conditions, can deteriorate into dangerous hypothermia within just a few hours, even in temperatures that wouldn't otherwise be life-threatening on their own. This means the very first and most urgent problem ancient humans needed to solve wasn't keeping rain out entirely, which was often simply impossible given the technology available to them. It was keeping their own bodies dry enough, often enough, to avoid that specific and genuinely lethal threshold, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. This is where clothing enters the story. And it's considerably more sophisticated than the popular image of cavemen wrapped sloppily in random animal pelts thrown carelessly over one shoulder. Tailored animal skin clothing, carefully scraped, stretched, and treated through a labor-intensive, multi-step process, provided both genuine waterproofing and meaningful thermal insulation, a combination modern outdoor gear companies still spend enormous research budgets trying to replicate with synthetic materials today, often with mixed success. The fur side worn outward could shed water in a manner surprisingly similar to how a duck's feathers repel rain, while the inner hide layer trapped warm air directly against the skin, creating a kind of early thermal envelope that modern layered clothing systems still essentially mimic. Some cultures developed methods of treating hides with animal fats and oils specifically to enhance water resistance further, effectively creating an early form of waterproofing treatment using nothing more than rendered fat rubbed methodically into the leather over repeated applications spread across days. None of this happened by accident or trial alone, discovered once and then forgotten. It represented generations of accumulated, carefully tested knowledge passed down. Through direct teaching and observation, knowledge about exactly which animals produced the most water-resistant hides exactly how those hides needed to be processed and cured before use, and exactly how garments needed to be cut and stitched to keep water from finding its way in through seams, gaps, and stitched edges that hadn't been properly sealed. Shelter mattered just as much, and ancient humans approached the problem of staying dry indoors with a level of architectural creativity that rarely gets enough credit in popular imagination, which still tends to picture our ancestors as fundamentally improvising rather than genuinely engineering solutions. Caves and natural rock shelters were the obvious first solution wherever the local geology cooperated. And there's a reason so much of what we know about prehistoric life comes specifically from cave sites scattered across the globe, from Europe to Africa to Asia. Caves offer something rain cannot easily defeat: an already complete, naturally engineered roof carved by water and time long before any human ever needed it, with walls thick enough to stay dry regardless of how long a storm lasted outside or how heavily it fell against the surrounding rock. In regions without convenient caves, ancient builders turned to constructed alternatives, frequently centered around steeply angled roofs covered with thick layers of thatch, woven painstakingly from reeds, grasses, or palm fronds depending on whatever was locally available in that particular environment and climate. The steep angle wasn't a stylistic choice made for appearances or tradition alone. It was functional engineering, refined over generations of trial and error. Water runs off a steep slope far faster than it can pool and seep through, and a properly layered thatch roof, with each successive layer overlapping the one below it like shingles on a modern house, channels water continuously downward and off the edge before it ever has the chance to soak all the way through to the living space underneath and ruin whatever was stored inside. Some cultures built dwellings with raised floors specifically to handle prolonged or seasonal flooding, lifting the entire living area above the waterline using support posts driven deep into the ground, an architectural solution that shows up independently across wildly different climates and continents, from stilt houses scattered throughout Southeast Asia to pile dwellings recorded across parts of prehistoric Europe near lakes and rivers, built by people who never had any contact with each other yet arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. The logic is identical everywhere it appears, regardless of who developed it or when in history. If you can't stop the water from coming, simply build above where the water is actually going to end up when it arrives in force. Drainage channels dug around the perimeter of a settlement, even crude ones scraped out with simple digging tools made from wood, bone, or stone, could redirect runoff away from living spaces and storage pits, preventing the kind of standing water that would otherwise rot food stores, ruin bedding, and create a genuinely miserable, disease-prone living environment for everyone forced to remain there through a long, sustained wet season with no relief in sight. Now here's where the story shifts from simple survival tactics to something considerably more dramatic: entire ecosystems, entire ways of life, and eventually entire early civilizations that didn't just endure heavy rainfall but were actually built around it from the very beginning, shaped fundamentally by its presence rather than merely tolerating it. Roughly 14,500 to 5,000 years ago, the region we now know as the Sahara Desert experienced what scientists call the African Humid Period, frequently nicknamed the Green Sahara. During this stretch, the African monsoon pushed dramatically further north than it does today, delivering sustained, heavy rainfall across a region that is currently one of the driest, most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, a transformation that modern visitors to the desert would find almost impossible to believe ever happened there. The transformation was staggering by any measure available to researchers studying the sediment record. Lakes formed across the open desert where today there is nothing but rock and sand for hundreds of miles in every direction. Rivers ran where there is now only endless dunes. Savanna grassland spread across territory that today supports almost nothing larger than scattered desert scrub clinging to survival. And ancient rock art discovered scattered across this region, first documented by a German explorer crossing the area by caravan in the mid-1800s, depicts a world that seems almost impossible to reconcile with the Sahara most people picture today. Swimmers, hippos, giraffes, elephants, and herds of cattle being driven by groups of hunters, painted onto rock surfaces in a landscape that today couldn't support a single one of those animals for more than a few hours before the heat and lack of water became fatal to any creature unfortunate enough to find itself stranded there. Human populations in the Sahara expanded rapidly during this wet period, settling into rock shelters like the one at Takarkori in southwestern Libya, where archaeologists have found nearly 5,000 years of continuous human occupation, layer after layer of accumulated daily life left behind in the sediment for researchers to carefully excavate, catalog, and interpret decades or centuries later. Researchers have even managed to extract ancient DNA from individuals buried at this site roughly 7,000 years ago, revealing a previously unknown North African genetic lineage that had remained isolated for thousands of years, quietly surviving and adapting through an environment most people today would assume was permanently, eternally hostile to sustained human life of any kind whatsoever. But the Green Sahara didn't last forever, and how it ended tells you almost as much about ancient human resilience and adaptability as how it began in the first place. The transition back to desert wasn't a single clean event happening suddenly overnight. Detailed sediment records from a basin in southern Ethiopia reveal that the ending was gradual, but genuinely turbulent, punctuated by repeated droughts lasting 20 to 80 years apiece. Recurring roughly every 160 years, interspersed with sudden bursts of extreme wetness that must have felt like a genuine reprieve before the rains failed yet again. An unstable climate flickering, back and forth before the region finally irreversibly dried out for good and settled into the desert we recognize today. Communities living through that transition had to repeatedly adapt to wild swings between flood and drought, sometimes within a single human lifetime, long before any of them could have known whether the rain was actually gone for good or simply taking an unusually long pause before eventually returning as it always had before. When the rains finally and permanently retreated around 5,000 years ago, populations didn't simply vanish into nothing or perish where they stood. They migrated, following the water as it withdrew southward and eastward across the continent, some moving toward the Nile Valley, some toward the Sahel, some toward what would become Lake Chad and the Niger River Valley, carrying with them generations of accumulated knowledge about exactly how to live successfully alongside unpredictable, dramatic rainfall in whatever new environment they eventually settled into and made their own. This pattern, entire civilizations rising and falling in direct response to the rhythm of seasonal rain, repeats itself dramatically elsewhere in the ancient world, and nowhere more clearly than with the Harappan civilization of the Indus River Valley, a culture whose scale and sophistication still surprises most people encountering it for the first time. Around 4,500 years ago, strong, reliable monsoon rains allowed the Harappans to farm the wide floodplains of the Indus River and its tributaries, supporting large, genuinely sophisticated cities with organized urban planning and advanced sanitation systems that rivaled or exceeded anything else being built anywhere else in the world at that time. In a region of the Indian subcontinent that most Westerners, even today, rarely learn much about in school despite its considerable scale and remarkable engineering achievements. At roughly the same time, in regions further south on the Indian peninsula, lush vegetation supported a completely different way of life entirely. Hunter-gatherer communities who never needed to build permanent settlements at all, because the abundant natural environment around them, fed by reliable rainfall year after year without fail, simply provided enough food without requiring anyone to plant, irrigate, or store anything in advance against future scarcity. Then the monsoon weakened, gradually at first and then more dramatically as the decades wore on. And the entire balance of the region flipped almost completely within a relatively short span of time, upending ways of life that had remained stable for centuries beforehand. The Harappans' agriculture, which had depended entirely on those strong, predictable seasonal rains arriving reliably on schedule every year, began to fail across the floodplain as the rains grew thinner and less dependable, and their once thriving cities were progressively abandoned in favor of smaller settlements clustered in the foothills of the Himalayas, closer to whatever water sources remained reliable as the broader regional climate continued to shift beneath them. Meanwhile, the southern peninsula, which had previously supported easy hunter-gatherer life through sheer natural abundance with comparatively little effort required to sustain it, became noticeably more arid as the rains shifted southward and away, and the people living there were pushed toward an entirely new strategy out of pure necessity: permanent farming settlements, something they had never needed before the climate forced their hand into a fundamentally different way of organizing their entire society. One civilization collapsed because the endless rain it depended on disappeared from the region it had built its entire existence around. Another one was born specifically because the easy natural abundance it depended on dried up at almost the exact same historical moment elsewhere on the same subcontinent. Rain, or its sudden and unwelcome absence, didn't just shape how individual people survived day to day in any given season. It directly shaped which entire way of life a region's population was eventually forced to adopt for generations afterward, reshaping social structures, settlement patterns, and economic systems in the process. There's also the matter of groundwater, a genuinely underappreciated piece of the survival puzzle that researchers have only recently begun to fully map out in detail using modern geological surveying techniques unavailable to earlier generations of scientists. A study focused on East Africa's Rift Valley, the so-called cradle of humanity, where our ancestors evolved over roughly 5 million years through countless generations of gradual adaptation, found that human survival through harsh arid stretches may have depended heavily on networks of natural springs. Not simply on rainfall itself or on the rivers and lakes that rainfall directly fed at the surface during wetter periods. These aren't small, occasional trickles of water barely worth noticing or mentioning. Researchers specifically studied large, substantial outflows of groundwater naturally buffered against the worst swings of climate change precisely because of the underlying geology involved in storing and gradually releasing it over time. Certain types of rock can quietly store rainwater that falls during wetter periods, and then release it slowly and steadily over the following years, even through extended stretches of drought when the surface rainfall itself becomes unreliable or disappears entirely for years on end without any sign of returning. This means our ancestors weren't solely dependent on whatever rain happened to be falling on any given week or month of any given year, vulnerable to every fluctuation in the weather. They were, whether they consciously understood the underlying geology behind it or simply recognized the practical pattern through direct experience, relying on a slow-release natural reservoir system that had been quietly filling and emptying for millennia, smoothing out the wild unpredictability of the rainfall itself into something closer to a dependable, if modest, year-round water supply that could be counted on even during the leanest stretches. This detail matters enormously for understanding the bigger picture of how ancient humans handled extreme and unpredictable rainfall over many generations of accumulated experience, because it reveals that survival was never simply about whether rain fell predictably or not in any given season alone. It was about whether a given landscape had the right underlying geological features to store and slowly redistribute that rain across the inevitable dry stretches that always followed eventually, regardless of how wet the preceding years had been. Communities that happened to settle near these natural buffering systems had a genuine, measurable survival advantage over communities that didn't, entirely independent of how skilled either group happened to be at building shelters or tailoring waterproof clothing for themselves, suggesting that geography itself, quite apart from human ingenuity, played a decisive role in determining which populations endured and which eventually didn't. Floods deserve their own separate mention here too, because endless rain doesn't just mean staying wet and cold for an extended stretch of time. It eventually means rising water, and ancient humans developed remarkably consistent strategies for managing that specific threat across completely unrelated regions of the world that had no meaningful contact with each other across vast distances and centuries. The earliest known systematic flood management strategies date back roughly to 7,600 BC, marking what researchers studying this history describe as the prehistoric era of organized flood response, long before any of the more famous ancient civilizations had even been founded. Communities living along major rivers, the Nile in Egypt and the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, being the most famous and well-documented examples available to historians today, eventually learned not just to tolerate seasonal flooding as an unfortunate inconvenience to be endured, but to actively depend on it for their entire way of life and economic survival. The Nile's predictable annual flood deposited a fresh layer of nutrient-rich silt across the surrounding floodplain every single year, without fail, effectively refertilizing farmland on a reliable schedule without any human labor required to make it happen on their own through artificial means. Ancient Egyptian agriculture wasn't built around avoiding the flood at all costs, the way a modern city might approach a rising river with dread. It was built entirely around the flood instead, with the timing of planting, harvesting, and even major religious festivals organized directly around when the waters were expected to rise and eventually fall back again each year in a cycle the entire civilization came to depend upon completely. But that same dependence on regular flooding required real, sophisticated engineering whenever the flood arrived with more force than expected or anticipated, threatening to tip from beneficial into destructive. Many ancient rulers and local leaders built dams and earthen embankments specifically to protect settlements, granaries, and farmland from flooding that exceeded the useful, beneficial range and tipped over into genuine, costly destruction instead of the gentle renewal everyone had come to expect. This represents a genuinely sophisticated risk calculation that ancient engineers were making constantly, season after season, year after year, generation after generation. How do you build infrastructure that welcomes a moderate, beneficial flood while still protecting your entire community from a catastrophic one, when both can look almost identical in their opening hours before anyone actually knows how high the water is going to climb before it finally crests and begins to recede back to normal levels? Pulling all of this together, the picture that emerges of how ancient humans survived endless rain isn't one of passive endurance, simply hunched miserably under shelter and waiting helplessly for the sky to eventually clear on its own. It's a picture of active, sophisticated adaptation unfolding across multiple overlapping fronts at once, refined patiently over countless generations of accumulated trial, error, and hard-won knowledge passed carefully down. Clothing engineered specifically to keep bodies dry and warm even when constantly exposed to driving rain day after day without relief. Shelters designed with steep, water-shedding roofs, raised floors, and carefully dug drainage channels, each one solving a specific practical problem posed directly by sustained precipitation in that particular environment and climate. Entire migration patterns that tracked the retreat and advance of monsoon systems across thousands of years, moving entire populations toward water as it shifted rather than stubbornly remaining in places the rain had permanently abandoned for good with no hope of return. Underground geological reservoirs that smoothed out the worst unpredictability of surface rainfall into something communities could actually plan their entire lives around with some real confidence. And entire agricultural systems in places like Egypt and the Indus Valley that didn't merely survive seasonal flooding as a recurring threat to be managed, but were deliberately built to depend on it completely, transforming what could have easily been an annual catastrophe into the very foundation of organized civilization itself for thousands of years afterward. The Sahara was once green because the rain simply never seemed to stop, for roughly 10,000 years at a stretch, reshaping an entire continent's climate and ecology in the process from top to bottom. And the humans living through that astonishing, sustained deluge didn't just scrape by on the margins of bare survival, waiting for it all to end. They built rock shelters that still stand today for archaeologists to study and marvel at. They created art that still moves people who see it scattered across cave walls thousands of years later, depicting a world that has since completely vanished from the landscape without leaving any other trace behind. And they left behind a genetic record that scientists are still carefully piecing together in laboratories right now, all in an effort to better understand exactly how an entire population adapted, generation after generation, to a world defined almost entirely by water falling endlessly from the sky above them, season after season. For longer than most modern civilizations have even existed, rain wasn't simply something ancient humans had to grimly survive and endure as a hardship to be tolerated. In enough places, across enough of human history, spanning multiple continents and multiple entirely separate civilizations with no contact between them, it was the very thing that made survival, and eventually civilization itself, possible in the first place.